Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
Fever, cough, congestion. When the symptoms keep coming, but you've got to keep going, you can rely on Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One. Just one dose of Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One relieves up to 9 cold and flu symptoms, helping you get on with your day. Need cold and flu relief? Get Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One and Done Relief. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from A Companion to Mr. Wells's Outline of History, written by Hilaire Belloc and published in 1927. This story provides somewhat of a critique of H.G. Wells's book, The Outline of History. My name is Teddy, and I am to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community that we have built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who reached out during the week, either via the website or via some other method. Your lovely messages and feedback are so appreciated. As I mentioned before, my goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everybody. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This removes Spotify ads and supports episode creation. If subscribing isn't possible, an easy way to help is by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. To support the show, you can always visit boytosleep.com. That is also a good way to say hello and send me a message. Of course, if you know anyone out there who also needs to get a good night's rest, please feel free to share the podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. A Companion to Mr. Wells's Outline of History by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 1. Introduction. My object in these pages is to follow, for Catholic readers, Mr. Wells's Outline of History, to point out the principal popular errors, most of them now out of date, which its author has repeated, and to state the opposing truths with their supporting evidence and reasoning. If it be asked why I should devote such labour to a book, which is but a passing fashion, and that not in the classes or districts which count most. I answer that, though ephemeral, the work has a wide circulation, and is therefore of some momentary effect worth checking, while it is also representative of this type. Writing of wide circulation, which repeats as facts for general exception theories, once respectable and now exploded. Now to check erroneous statement is always worthwhile. If it be asked why I envisage a Catholic audience in particular, I answer that the issue in such matters lies between the Catholic Church and its modern opponents. The hosts of modern writers in all countries, of whom Mr. Wells is a local example, act more or less consciously in reaction against the Catholic Church. It is her doctrines they are concerned to attack, and soon with the increasing effect of the Church upon one hand, the increasing abandonment outside her boundaries of all transcendental belief on the other, there will be but two opposed camps, the faith and its enemies. Already the denial of a personal God, of immortality, of the redemption, of the fall, of the incarnation, of the resurrection, is no longer directed against some vague Christianity, a word with 20 meanings or none, but against that defined and existing corporation which alone defends in its entirety that body of dogma upon which our civilization has been founded and with the loss of which it will perish. Further, I have the legitimate motive of sustaining others. There are Catholics into whose hands a work of this kind falls, and it is possible that here and there a Catholic may be disturbed in his faith by popular literature of this kind. For the sake of this very small number of chance, Catholics who may suffer from a popular, though ephemeral work of this kind, I desire to examine the book and distinguish its merits from its absurdities. One Catholic disturbed in his faith is more important than a host of the average reading public of England and America, drowsily accepting stuff they have heard all their lives, and reading it because they have always believed it to be true. A Catholic disturbed in his faith is like a man troubled with his sight. A Catholic losing his faith is like a man going blind. One should take a great deal of trouble to prevent a man from going blind. I am aware that to aver such a motive reads presumptuous and a little ridiculous, for faith is strongest in the humble. But the motive is there, and at any rate the important thing is that Mr. Wells's widely read, though necessarily short-lived survey of human affairs, with its violently anti-Catholic motive, should not be of effect on any Catholic mind, so far as a Catholic critic can provide the antidote. Every man, even the idlest, occupies his time with something or other. The vast majority of men have their energies absorbed by their daily tasks. So when a man comes forward with a mass of historical facts, drawn from encyclopedias, which not one man in 1,000 has had the leisure to look up in those books of reference, and tacks on these historical facts all manner of false conclusions, destructive of the only truth worth having, destructive of the one gasp on reality which is of any value to men, the reader may well be misled. He may easily say to himself, since all these historical facts are presumably true, the conclusions tacked on to them are so probably true, and in this way a false philosophy is insinuated. Mr. Wells's main motive, the honestly held conviction which drives him to writing matter of this kind, is reaction against the Catholic Church. But as this motive is not stated, and indeed I fancy not fully conscious in the mind of the writer, the reader may take his work to be neutral in matter. In doing so, false history and therefore false philosophy may without his knowledge pass into his mind. It is this which is important to prevent. At the outset of my task, it behoves me to set forth the great talents with which Mr. Wells has been endowed by Almighty God, and especially the talents suitable to the writer of general history. For indeed he seemed from his earlier works admirably fitted for writing a general outline of history, and would, by consent of all, have been thought apt for the task, had he not undertaken it. First, he writes very clearly. He practices an excellent economy in the use of words. This, for popular exposition, is essential, and he never fails in it. He never lapses into verbosity. He is direct, simple, clear. Next, he possesses a sense of time. Now in history, nothing is more valuable. Within his lights, within the measure of his limited instruction, he does see time in right scale, and that is so rare in any historian that one cannot welcome it too warmly. Next, we should remark that Mr. Wells has, as his works of fiction amply show, a strong power of making the image he has framed in his own mind arise in the mind of his reader. This is, indeed, his chief talent. It is a talent that is extremely rare, the very essential of good, imaginative writing, but of particular importance in historical writing. For history, as the great Michelet finally put it, should be a resurrection of the flesh. Were I engaged upon a critique of Mr. Wells's more permanent literary claims, I would dilate on this, for such a gift is of quite exceptional power in him. None of our contemporaries possesses it in anything like the same degree. But I am not concerned here with his style, and must reluctantly leave it. Next, it is worth noting that Mr. Wells is exceedingly accurate in his use of reference books and proofreaders. The dates are always right, and the names and all the mechanical details of the book are similarly exact. I have a particular right to praise such a quality, because in my own case, as in the case of the great Michelet whom I have just quoted, I despair of accuracy. My own writings on history are full of misprints, right for left, in descriptions of battles, north for south, east for west, transposed letters and the rest of it. Mr. Wells's writing is quite remarkable for its freedom from such irritating verbal blemishes. But much more important than these advantages which he possesses for a writing of an outline of history is his sincerity. He feels the importance of history to mankind, and especially, I think, to that part of mankind which he knows best, the mankind of the English home counties and London suburbs. He feels instinctively that he and his must now obtain a general view. It is due to Mr. Wells to say that hardly anyone else in our restricted society feels this as strongly as he does. Our newspapers, our politicians, and even our financiers, cosmopolitan though they are, do not feel the need of trying to understand the past of Europe and of the world. They are still soaked in what is left to the old self-sufficiency. But Mr. Wells has woken up, and it is to his credit. I put his sincerity thus last in this category of his advantages for writing history, because it is the chief. He is conspicuously and naively sincere. This good quality is apparent in every line of the work as it first appeared. It is equally apparent in the first part of the new revised edition. He does really believe from the bottom of his heart all that he read in the textbooks of his youth. He does really and from the bottom of his heart believe that the little world he knows is the whole world, and that his doctrines of goodwill, vague thinking, loose loving, and the rest, all soaked in the local atmosphere of his life, may be the salvation of mankind. It is not vanity or pride. It is a perfectly honest conviction. He cannot imagine how things could possibly be otherwise, and that, by the way, is the root of his recently acquired hatred of the Catholic Church, which has now become, directly and indirectly, the universally present savour in his writing. He is sincerely bewildered and exasperated at the power of something so different from the only world he knows. He hopes vaguely that the Church may be dying. He suspects it is not. The doubt worries him. It moves him to hatred, but that hatred is sincere. This sincerity of his, even where it is misguided and untaught, is respectable. He does sincerely desire to do good to his fellow men within the narrow circle of his experience and understanding. If the reader will add up all these advantages for the writing of history, he will find them amount, I think, to a very notable sum. There are very few men who could have produced a general history better than Mr. Wells, had he not suffered from certain graver disadvantages to which I shall presently allude. To be sincere is essential. To have the motive of history is both singular and decisive. To have clarity, economy, and a sense of time is rare and of high value. To be accurate in detail of dates, etc., is a most excellent minor virtue in any historian. Mr. Wells has called me an inveterate antagonist. He is wrong. From the first moment that the time machine appeared so many years ago, I have consistently praised his talents in private conversation and in public writing, and I shall praise them still. Before I leave this point to his advantages in the writing of history, let me deal very briefly with certain false accusations that have been made against him. The first, and I think the stupidest, is that of brevity. I have heard people say, here is a man pretending to write a history of the world in a few months, and in a few pages, and they have laughed at him on that ground. The accusation is unintelligent. You can give the outline of the history of anything in a sentence, or a paragraph, or a pamphlet, or a book, or an encyclopedia. If Napier, the great historian of the Peninsular War, perhaps the greatest English writer of history, had been asked to state in one sentence the outline of that struggle, he might have replied, "The Spanish national feeling engaged with French usurpation was supported by a small English regular army possessed of the command of the sea. These two forces combined achieved, after Napoleon's disaster in Russia, the driving out of the French from the peninsula." If he had been given a page in which to write the thing, he could have added phrases upon the talent of Wellington as a defensive general, the misconception of the French upon the Spanish national feeling, the skill with which the lines of Torres Vedras were drawn, etc. Had he been given 50 pages, he could have added more detail still, and so on up to a shelf full of books. But the outline from such a pen would have been good history, had it covered 10 lines or 10,000. It is thoughtless to say that a man has no right to give an outline of any movement, however great in any space, however small. The Catechism puts the whole vast business of man through the time and eternity into one short phrase, that we were made to know, love, and serve God, and to be happy with Him forever. You could add that to all the rest of true philosophy in as much detail as you like, and still expand. But the original brief outline of less than a score of words remains true. Mr. Wells has a perfect right to produce an outline of general history in 1 volume, or half a volume, or a page, and so far as the manner of it goes, he has done it excellently. The drawing is firm, the intention honest. It is the shape of the outline that is wrong. Again, he is wrongly accused of superficiality. That is an accusation made by people who see, what indeed is obvious, that the book has no lasting value, and that therefore they can call it hard names with impunity. The book is ephemeral, certainly, but no honest critic can call it superficial. The book is not superficial at all. On the contrary, it goes to the roots of things and considers what is really important to mankind. One may indeed call the writer superficial in so far as he knows nothing of beauty or tradition. That is due to his unavoidable limitations. But superficial his effort is not. It is as searching in the matter of cause and effect as its writer can make it. That is not saying very much, for its writer has never had the opportunity for digging deep into cause and effect. But the book does not suffer from that prime mark of superficiality, indifference. Mr. Wells means to say all that is in him, and if there is not very much in him, that is not his fault. He has a neutral quality, neither a disadvantage or an advantage in the writing of history, or perhaps rather an advantage than a disadvantage, and that is an intense nationalism. Such nationalism is often the unconscious accompaniment of limitation, but upon the whole it serves the historical sense. After all, any worker must be himself. He cannot create unless there is a flame within him. Such flames arise from intense conviction, and the historian steeped in his own country does better, in my judgment, despite his inevitable leanings, than one who pretends attachment to nothing, for attachment to nothing is sterility. The 3 great historians whom good judges most admire were all intense lovers of their country, an Athenian, a Frenchman, and a Scotsman. Now for the disadvantages. The first and most glaring of these is provincialism. But here I must warn my readers that they will not discover in this criticism any of those personal descriptions or offensive allusions to private life by which our vulgarians aim at extending their large circulations. I am concerned only with this one book of Mr. Wells's, and with history and religion in it, not with domestic details in the author's life or the caricatures of them. The mental formation and social motive of an author must indeed be alluded to in any judgment of his work, as must his defects of instruction or judgment. The rest is irrelevant. I have even, in revising the text, cut out anything which might be mistaken for a personal allusion and leave it, I believe, confined wholly to the criticism of historical statement, method, and motive. I have said then that with so many qualifications for writing a popular general history, Mr. Wells suffers from defects which ruin it, and the first of these is that book of his which is provincial. The word provincial is a hard one, but it exactly applies to Mr. Wells's history, therefore it must be used. I find it more difficult to use this necessary and precise word here, because I know Mr. Wells from an acquaintance of many years, to be abnormally sensitive to any printed judgment of his work. Such extreme sensitiveness is not rare in men of vivid imagination, especially if they cultivate its literary expression. But in this case, it is quite exceptionally developed, and I naturally hesitate to offend it. Greatly as I admire Mr. Wells's scientific romances, and have always admired them, I am compelled to use exact terms in this criticism. I cannot do otherwise, because the truth of history is a sacred thing, the most sacred next to the truths of religion. If history is falsely written, the reader not warned of it obtains a distorted view of human action and comes to misunderstand all the most essential things of life, including religion itself, and Mr. Wells's history is obviously and fatally distorted through provincialism. Provincialism does not mean a limitation of experience to some one small department of life. We are all of us subjected to such limitations, and any man's petty personal experience is always infinitely small compared with the total possible field of knowledge. Nor does provincialism mean seeing things through the medium of one's own habitat and character, both necessarily limited. All men must see, and can only see, through some such limited medium. No, provincialism means thinking that one knows all about it. Provincialism means a satisfied ignorance, a simple faith in the non-existence of what one has not experienced. Provincialism involves a contempt for anything foreign, what is worse, an actual denial of things which the provincial person has not made familiar with. It is provincialism in a yokel when he laughs at you for not knowing the way to his local railway station. It is not provincialism to say, "I don't know about this. It is new to me. I must examine it before I accept it." But it is provincialism to say, as the Frenchman in the story did of Joan of Arc, "It can't be true. If it were, I should have heard of it." It is not provincialism to say, "I far prefer the atmosphere and institutions of my own country to those of any other." But it is provincialism to think that the Cathedral of Seville must necessarily be inferior to the Crystal Palace, because it was built by Dagos, and that anyone who thinks otherwise is either a humbug or a fool. It would not have been provincial in Mr. Wells to have written the character of Napoleon repels me. Give me rather the honest Englishman of my acquaintance than this hard and profound Southerner. But it is dreadfully provincial to belittle Napoleon's immense capacities. It would not be provincialism in me, who do not know German, to say that Heine in translation had not moved me, and that when the German of Heine was read aloud to me, it seemed to me harsh compared with the exquisite music of Keats. But it would be gross provincialism in me, were I to lay it down, ignorant as I am of German, that Heine was no poet, that his reputation was exaggerated, and that, say, Schiller was his superior in the management of the German tongue. Yet that is how Mr. Wells treats Napoleon. Now this vice of provincialism runs right through Mr. Wells's outline of history, from beginning to end. The moment he is on a thing that is not of his religion and social experience, he rejects it or blunders on it. I shall have many occasions for pointing this out in my criticism of the book, but I may mention here, by way of example, one of these many to which I shall return. This is Mr. Wells's hopelessly provincial attitude towards the fragmentary record of the Gospels. He can only think of the events recorded as though they were taking place in the time and place he himself has known. They took place as a fact in the 1st century and in the Roman Empire. He imagines them taking place in a world where the supernatural elements of the story could only have been introduced gradually and after the death of the founder, whereas, in point of fact, the atmosphere of that time was in every class of society especially apt to the reception of the supernatural. There was skepticism among them, but the skepticism of society in the 1st century was not like our skepticism, and, quite apart from the question whether such a state of mind were wise or unwise, the men of the 1st century accepted the thaumaturge and expected the marvellous in connection with religion. The next disadvantage which I find in Mr. Wells for the writing of an outline of history is one which he has developed somewhat late in life, which is more and more warping his writing as a whole, and which is quite fatal to any attempt at history. This is his entertaining unreasoning reactions, which one may now without exaggeration term rabid. These reactions have a common root. They are all provoked by anything traditional. It is tradition, its usage and nobility, which irks our author. Lineage offends him, and whatever is venerable and great. He suffers these reactions against the gentry, especially the gentry of his own country, against soldiers, great military characters in history, against certain contemporaries of his, but most of all against the Catholic Church, to be thus provoked to action by others, not to direct one's pen of one's own initiative, but to have it jerked into action by the strength of another, is weakening to all authors, but it is death to the historian. For history, of all forms of writing, most demands a general and balanced action of the mind, free from all control save that of a calm, inward judgment. Here I would have my reader note the exact words I use, for I use them with discretion and after having fully weighed them. I do not mean that the dislike of a particular type, such as that of the English gentleman, or of certain individuals, or of a powerful institution, such as is the Catholic Church, necessarily makes a man a bad historian. Every vivid writer must have affections and distastes, and history that is not vivid is not worth writing. But when that distaste becomes unreasoning through violence, when it has the quality which we call rabid, a quality of impulse and unrestraint, the quality which makes men yell or pile on superlatives, or descend to mere insult, then you have a quality useful perhaps in pamphleteering, but fatal to the reputation of an historian. I do not mean that this quality is to be deplored in all writing or speaking. Far from it. It is of great value in rhetoric. It will often move men in the direction desired. It is often justly applied to something evil against which an honest indignation is felt. What I do say is that in history it is out of place in proportion to its being unreasoning, and unreason is the very essence of these instinctive reactions. Cobbett's History of the Reformation, for instance, is a first-rate piece of literary work, but bad history because in his hatred of the Reformation he accepts anything against it, such as the impossible story of Anne Boleyn being Henry VIII's daughter, and loses the faculty for weighing evidence. To judge by his books, Mr. Wells came up against the English idea of a gentleman early in life. He probably thought it an illusion, and a harmful one from the first. Very many will here argue with him. But later on he became obsessed by one thing. He came to hate everything connected with what used to be called in England the governing class. He grew to hate Latin and Greek, because these are, or were, the basis of a gentleman's schooling, soldiering because it was by tradition a gentleman's profession. He hates it all, even down to the spurs worn by officers. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. I also hope you're feeling a little drowsy. If you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.